Press.
I call the study session of the City of Ashland Planning Commission to order for January 27th, 2026. This is a joint study session with our guests, the mayor, city council, and the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee. And I'll note that our meetings are available on Zoom and RBTV, and the public may find information on how to participate in Planning Commission meetings in our public notices, as well as directions on how to find the full meeting materials, applications, and staff reports. I do note that we have 5 of 7 commissioners here this evening, so we do have a quorum. Announcements. Brandon, do you have anything for us?
No.
Wow, okay. So we'll move on to public forum. And anybody in the audience wish to speak to the Planning Commission on an item that's not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to our main event, which is a discussion item on the mobile manufactured home park zoning concept. And I'd like to welcome our guests, the City Council, the Mayor, and again, the Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee. Thank you very much for being here and being on Zoom. And we will review and discuss proposed development code concepts and recommendations for establishing a new manufactured home park zone, an MHPZ designation, and aligning Ashland's code with state housing statutes and best practices. We have Brandon here, Brandon Goldman, and Linda Reed from our staff, and John Friganese from Journey.
Scott Freganesi.
Scott, sorry. And Journey, I didn't get your last name, but anyway, we have 2 people from 3J Consulting. And I'll turn it over to Brandon.
Thank you, Chair Werner. And by merit of introduction to this item, the manufactured home park zone is a project that was identified as one of the strategic actions in the 2023 housing production strategy. It's one of approximately 15 strategies that the city committed to advancing in order to expand housing choice and housing affordability over the 8-year period following its adoption. Particularly what we're here to discuss tonight is the manufactured home park zone, which focuses on supporting and maintaining manufactured home parks as a critical housing resource within our community. So as the purpose of tonight's session, it's the joint session, which is an opportunity for Housing and Human Services Advisory Committee, Planning Commission, and City Council to learn about the work that's been completed to date, but most importantly, it's a chance to ask questions, raise concerns, and identify areas that individuals feel need further consideration as we draft code amendments, which would be brought back before public hearings for review and adoption. So this is really a working conversation rather than a decision-making meeting. So there'll be ample opportunity to review the work that comes out of this study session at decision-making meetings before each of the bodies I mentioned. I also wanted to acknowledge that this project and our work with 3J Consulting was funded through the Department of Land Conservation and Development through a technical assistance grant. And this affords the city the ability to carefully evaluate both our existing code, our manufactured housing development code, as well for looking at compliance with state law and really preparing hearings-ready amendments. As Chair Werner noted, Linda Reed is our Housing Program Manager, Brandon Goldman, Community Development Director, and Scott Freganesi and Journey Gehring from 3J Consulting are attending via Zoom and will be doing a presentation. So that presentation has been included in your packets, but for those people that might be watching at home, it's an opportunity to see the work that's been done. I also wanted to acknowledge the work that's been done to date, being informed by a management advisory committee that represents residents, professionals, and elected officials. Namely, Rich Rohde, a community member, participated, Alan Ackroyd and Dolores Nims, both manufactured home park residents, Amy Gunter, a local planner, Ryan Hayes of the Housing Authority of Jackson County participated, and the Housing Authority of Jackson County is also a park owner, so it provides insight in terms of from that perspective. And last but not least, John Mayer, Planning Commission and Housing and Human Services Committee member. And before we turn it over to the consultants, I did want to talk about why this work matters. So the manufactured home parks are one of Ashland's most important forms of naturally occurring affordable housing. And a central goal of the housing production strategy was to preserve these parks. And one means of doing that is to allow for opportunities for reinvestment into the parks to upgrade them. And so some of the discussion we'll have tonight about allowances for non-conforming conditions to be not require coming into full compliance with land use or building code when redevelopment occurs. Getting ahead of myself. But I would also want to note that much of the existing code in our Chapter 18 land use was drafted decades ago, and by that I mean 40 plus years ago. And as we all know, the nature and type of manufactured housing homes at that time was largely dictated to resemble single-family, traditional steep-pitched roof homes. But emerging manufactured home types that are available today come in many different forms, including different heights, different layouts, and this is an opportunity to adapt the code to modernize it to accommodate these changes, obviously without sacrificing safety and livability. So we're looking at removing the outdated standards that limit flexibility within the parks, allow those modern home styles, size configuration that weren't anticipated in the original code, and particularly some of the design standards in the packet materials that you received speak to those. The incremental improvements without displacement of residents, that's what I was referring to in the non-conforming. And importantly, establish tenant protections that provide residents an opportunity to organize and pursue resident-owned community models when a park is offered for sale. So that is relatively new, and I know that our consultants have done some research on it and will touch base on it. So I also wanted to note that Oregon law requires that manufactured homes be regulated in the same manner as comparable site-built single-family homes. And this is House Bill 4064, which established by statute some provisions. And we do have sections in our existing code that do have added requirements for manufactured homes. So similar to other ordinances that have come before council, there is the potential of coming forward with those that are legally mandated to change and those that are policy decision. Much of what we're working on is in the policy arena, but it's also a house cleaning opportunity to remove some of those limitations on manufactured homes as we go forward. And with that framing, I'll turn it over to our consultant team to walk through their analysis and recommendations. But again, just to reiterate, this is a conversation, so if you have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. Thank you, and hi, Scott.
Hi, everyone. My name's Scott Fraganesi. As Brandon eloquently gave a wonderful introduction to this project. What I'd like to do is just go through this presentation. I'd like to leave as much time for everyone to answer questions afterwards. So I'll hold for questions till after the presentation, then we can kind of get into anything that comes up with that. And I appreciate having the City Council, the Planning Commission, and the Housing and Human Services Committee in one work session. I think it's a great way for you all to be informed about the project. So I'll share my screen and we'll get through this presentation, then have that conversation and questions. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So again, I'm going to go through a little bit of a project overview, and this is going to be a lot of what Brandon talked about, but I'll reiterate it because I think it's always good to hear things twice. Again, this is part of your housing production strategy, and one of the things that came out of that recommendation was to look at manufactured housing development specifically. Again, it was a grant. This project is funded through the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, so they're funding this. And 3J Consulting was lucky enough to be the consultant that was contracted to do this code audit. I'm particularly excited to continue to work in Ashland. Ashland's my hometown. John Freganesi, who I'm happy to be called this evening. It was my father, and I grew up in Ashland, so it's always great to be back in my hometown. The ordinance really is going to look at design standards. I'll talk a little bit tonight about lot size, setback, utilities, and just general standards. And then I also want to point out that there is a lot of public involvement. Brandon mentioned the committee that we have, but also working with you in terms of the council, planning commission, and housing and human services committee. So that's really important. Really, the purpose of this was already mentioned as well, but we want to try and facilitate housing production and affordability and choice. Part of this is also making sure that we exceed current housing statutes that are by the state, which are part of that House Bill 2001. And then also developing new manufactured housing park zone that's intended to preserve existing parks. And that's some of those protections and things that we can do in the code to allow for potential resident-owned communities and things like that. And then also explore allowances for higher density. How do we allow these existing parks to introduce more units? So in terms of the housing production strategy, what we're really relying on here is that encouragement of development of low to moderate income affordable housing. As Brandon mentioned, this is your natural occurring affordable housing. And we want to encourage that and increase opportunities for that, as well as looking at preserving those affordable housing units. So that's kind of one of the main goals, and building off that housing production strategy. In terms of this specific project, the key tasks are really this code audit and concepts. And that's really where we are now. We're presenting you what we've done to date and some of the concepts and recommendations that we're going to move forward with into the drafting those code amendments and those final code amendments before we bring them back to you all for formal adoption, which will go through both the Planning Commission and Council, and hopefully be successful and supported by both all these decision-making bodies. I wanted to bring up the project schedule. We started back last summer, and we've really worked hard, and we're at a point where we've had a couple of the committee meetings already. We're now in January, where have the code audit and concepts complete, which we're going to show you tonight. We've started drafting the code amendments, and then I think we're really close to being on schedule. I think we may go into March, April, and May into adoption. Adoption typically takes longer, but if we get started in March, I think we'll be right on schedule to complete this on time. So I wanted to go through your existing manufactured home parks, just so I make sure everyone is aware of all of them. You have 6 of them. 3 of them are in your city limits, and there's 3 of them that are outside the city limits, but within your urban growth boundaries, so they still apply here today. The first one is Wingspread. That's off Clay Street, 321 Clay, and this is the largest of Ashland's manufactured home parks at about 20 acres and about 116 units, and that's zoned R2, so it has a current residential zone. Secondly, you have Tolman Creek, which is about 6.6 acres and 38 units, and that's zoned R1 to 3.5, so again, a residential zone. And the Pines, this one is fairly unique, and that's on Siskiyou Boulevard. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It includes 51 units, but also the 2-story commercial building on Ashland Street and 1 small commercial building on Siskiyou Boulevard. And it's about 2.6 acres. And I say this is unique because it is zoned commercial. It's a C1 zone, which is different than the other manufactured home parks in Ashland. Then following up with the 3 that are not in the city limits, we have Siskiyou Village. It's about 49 units. We have Nauvoo, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, Park Estates, which is off Highway 99. It's about 42 plus units. And then we have the manufactured home park at Jackson Wells Springs, where I always enjoyed swimming as a young man. There's about 16 permanent units there and some short-term rentals as well that are. So I just hopefully now everyone's familiar with the current parks. And then we'll get into a few of the things that we did so far, the first few tasks of this. One of the things we did was we did case studies, and we looked at 3 different jurisdictions that have successfully implemented manufactured home parks that increase densities or implemented zones that are specific to manufactured homes. Interestingly enough, when we first started this project, I thought, oh, this will be easy to find lots of jurisdictions throughout Oregon that have done this, but frankly, not many have. So I think that, Ashland's kind of on the leading edge in terms of looking at this specifically as an issue and something that you want to protect and move forward into the future in terms of your housing supply. So the 3 cities that we looked at were Portland, Oregon, Bellingham, Washington, and Fort Collins, Colorado. Now, all these cities are larger than Ashland, but I think that there were some lessons that were learned from all 3. I'd also point out that we do have a memo that goes into detail about this that you can request and we can provide if you'd like some more information, because I'm just lightly touching on it in the presentation. But in terms of some of the conclusions that came out of these case studies that we thought could be useful here in Ashland are, in terms of what Portland did, they emphasized flexibility. And that was really things like incentivizing density and integration with the affordable housing goals, which I think is something we can do here in Ashland. Bellingham actually did a lot more in terms of long-term preservation of tenant rights, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But we're kind of borrowing some ideas for them, and they had created strict land use controls with a protective overlay and notification process, and that notification process is something that we'll discuss further. Fort Collins, Colorado prioritized land use consistency and design standards. So that's another thing we'll talk about, and changing some of those and updating the zoning framework while limiting some other compatible uses. And we've also built into that into some of our recommendations. So I think those case studies were actually quite valuable in terms of lessons learned and things that we can borrow and ideas that work in other jurisdictions that Ashland can use as well. We did some stakeholder interviews. We conducted interviews with park owners or representatives specifically because we really wanted to understand, their desire for potential zone changes or things that they needed to be successful for long term and not, look to changing those uses. Some of the things that they said when we did these interviews, they want to support modernization without penalizing upgrades. So they're running into some issues with doing updates to sewer or road or things like that, because in some instances they are not non-conforming uses and then would be subject to being brought up to conform in all areas. So that was one key theme. They were really interested in increasing flexibility for those non-conforming uses. How can we allow them to continue and support them and without having them have to go away? And then clearly balancing protection with practical incentives. So one of the things we did when we did these interviews is we said, hey, what if we give you some incentives to look at some protection things in terms of the long-term viability of these parks? And they were interested in that as well. One of the main things we wanted to do is kind of gauge their interest in actually doing a specific zone. So rezoning these areas for manufactured housing parks in the future. Most of the owners did not really want that. They thought that they preferred to keep the existing base zone and not explore a zone change, but they were interested in allowing for some changes in flexibility that would increase densities and allow those parks to be financially viable in the future. We talked about those incentives already, but they didn't feel that those additional density allowances and some of the relaxed standards really outweighed the necessity to change the base zone. So they preferred that base zone over a specific zone for a manufactured housing zone. And then one of the other things I thought was pretty interesting was they all were really interested in continuing to operate as manufactured parks. Only one of them had explored redevelopment options, and they mentioned looking at apartments as a possibility, but it really wasn't financially feasible. And in terms of their profitability and their margins, I think they're doing well financially. So I think that's why they felt that it was, they were interested in continuing that use into the future. One of the other things that they were interested into is, being able to modernize and streamline the existing code, making it easier for them to meet those regulations. And then one thing that's really important, I think there's still a path forward to doing this and allowing for upgrades and modernization and protections without a new zone. Either way, we're going to be updating the existing code through this project. And I guess the other thing I'd say that there's many ways to improve the code, and I think we're going to discuss some of that in our recommendations this evening. I want to go through quickly some of the key themes before I get into recommendations for the code. There's basically 6 of them that came out of our code audit, which we dove into after we did the case studies and interviews. The current code includes minimum maximum densities that kind of constrain development. So we're going to look at density and lot standards. We're going to look at setback and dimensional flexibilities. I mentioned setbacks. And currently they vary across those zones, and it would be really nice to be able to apply setbacks to all of the manufactured home parks, so they would be consistent, even though they have parent zones that are maybe different. And then landscaping and open space standards may act as development barriers. We'll see that in part of the recommendation too, but sometimes there's too much of a requirement for those things for some of these parks. The fourth one is looking at, many of the older manufactured home parks have challenges. I already mentioned this, but because they're non-conforming and have aging infrastructure, they want to upgrade some of these things. But to do those upgrades, they're required to do an overhaul of the entire park, which may not be financially feasible in some regards. And then also, one of the things that was kind of cool that came out of this, and it already exists in the Pines, as I mentioned, but allowing for non-residential community serving uses on some of these parks. So you're allowing things that might be a daycare or office or maybe a coffee shop or clubhouse in these parks, which aren't currently allowed, which could be an on-site amenity and make them even more financially feasible and more desirable for folks who want to live in them. And then the 6th one is actually one of the more important ones, and I think that we're really going to strive for as part of this project, and that's that tenant and affordability protections. So balancing that desire for redevelopment or financial gain from ownerships with residential stability and allowing for some protections and measures to be considered as part of the zone code update. So those are the themes, and this next section is really the longest part of the presentation, but it really is important because these are the code audit recommendations that we're going to come back to you all with in terms of the code update. So based on these recommendations, we're going to look at your code, and we're going to redline it, and we're going to make specific recommendations of what needs to stay and what needs to change, and then come up with some development or some adoption ready ordinances that we will present to you as part of the adoption process. So I mentioned this already, but modernizing the lot standards. So that's, again, removing the maximum and minimum densities. There's lot width requirements that we could reduce in size. There's also density that's regulated. And I think what we should really look at is look at fire access, infrastructure capacity, open space, and lot area rather than specific density regulations. And again, this will help with eliminating barriers to housing production. The dimensional issues we run into, we want to increase flexibility with that. Right now, the code says you have to be 12 feet, these manufactured homes have to be at least 12 feet wide, but wide. There's other products that might be 10 feet wide. So we're actually considering lowering that from 12 to 10, or actually maybe even removing that and allowing for even more flexibility in terms of the size of those manufactured homes. Looking at changing the setbacks from 5 feet to 5 feet on all internal sides or the minimum fire code standards. So we could eliminate those in entirety and just say, just meet fire code. And then there's some other things that are currently in there talking about porches and decks and within setbacks and near and their proximity to other manufactured homes. And so maybe we need to remove those if they're made with fire safe materials, for example, and then apply those universal standards to manufactured home parks regardless of the zone, which I already mentioned. And that'll do things like reduce complexity to the and improve efficiency, and allow for other design options. Also, removing standards that exceed state law. So we talked about being in compliance with House Bill 2001 and some other new regulations. So we need to really look at eliminating floor area requirements to mimic single-family homes, remove those pitch requirements, as we talked about, and even Brandon mentioned in his introduction. Some of the exterior material mandates that are not mentioned in HUD regulations could also be removed. And then applying some standards, the same design standards as single-family homes to single-lot manufactured homes. So if you go in and put a single manufactured home on a single lot that's not in a park, that we'd apply the same standards you would use for a single-family stick-built home, so that it would be very compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. Again, this improves your legal compliance and reduces barriers to development. I mentioned this already, but the landscaping and open space requirements could be simplified. So 50% of the unbuilt area would be proposed. Common open space would be at 5% of the total area, which is higher now, and allow overlapping between these areas. So you can kind of combine the passive recreational areas and the common open spaces, which I think is really important. And many times you can if you reduce some of the landscaping requirements, you can actually have more units, and it's kind of a way to improve and add more density, if you will, add more units. This one's really important. Looking at creating a clear path for the redevelopment of existing parks, not changing the use, but a redevelopment of some of the older units or some of the infrastructure, or even maybe new uses like those clubhouses or daycares that we talked about allowing. So in terms of that, the proposal is looking at conditional use review for some of the non-conforming things. So you could, instead of just saying it's non-conforming, you have to be brought into conformance, we look at conditional use for that. And then also looking at phase compliance. So, and that's really important. So you consider things like health and safety and infrastructure upgrades as part of that, rather than only specifically focusing in on the code. And then looking at financial hardships when allowing for that conditional use. That's an important thing about conditional use is if an applicant can come in and say, hey, we can't do this, but we need to do this for safety and health reasons. How can we be allowed to do these minor upgrades maybe over time rather than doing them all at once? And again, this is really important because it can encourage reinvestment without having any displacement in the current parks. And it recognizes the constraints of those legacy parks that have been there well before these codes were drafted. Also allowing limited non-residential use. This is one of the cool ideas, and this actually kind of came from the Pines. Currently they have the coffee shop and they have a two-story building there. So we said, why should we not allow some of these other uses in these manufactured park zones, and maybe it'll make them more desirable, as I already mentioned. So the proposal is kind of to allow up to 20,000 square foot community serving buildings. And I think that those could be things like offices, community rooms, childcare, cafes or services. Also, in the Pines, they have a couple of apartment units in one of those buildings that are within that zone. So thinking about that too, if you had a two-story building with a coffee shop, maybe you could have apartments above that could be allowed as outright uses within those manufactured parks. And I think one of the things that's cool about this is it supports those daily needs and it reduces vehicle trips. If folks that live in those parks can get what they need locally and not have to hop in a car, that's important for them, and also again makes those maybe more desirable for the residents to live in. This is also another recommendation. So updating manufactured home unit standards, allowing the option of 2 small units. So we thought, why can't you have more than 1 unit on those lots if they're tiny homes per se? So if they're 400 square foot or smaller, you could allow 2 units. You could have 2 per lot, which would really double the units there. And then removing those mandatory deck and patio size requirements. Currently, there's quite sizable requirements for deck and patios for each of the units, and maybe they could share those, or they didn't have to be as large. And then allowing for that flexibility and orientation and placement. So maybe those homes don't need to be, linear along the lot size. Maybe they can be placed in different areas. So again, that's going to be important because it allows for smaller homes that are more affordable and expands those affordability options. And then this one's, again, one of my favorites, and this is one of the kind of important reasons why we're looking at this project, and that's strengthen the stability and anti-displacement measures for tenants. So extend notice requirements for park sale or closure or redevelopment. So we're looking at how that's done. This really came out of that Bellingham example that I mentioned earlier. And that's really to allow for partnerships with folks like CASA or ROC USA, which would make provisions for right of first refusal timelines for purchase of those by the communities that live there, by the actual tenants that live there would be able to potentially purchase those and own them outright as a community in perpetuity. So I think this really addresses the unique vulnerability of those manufactured home residents, and it aligns with best practices from Bellingham and other communities that have utilized these types of strategies. And then I think this is just kind of a procedural thing, but we need to really clarify the procedures, and that's explicit to manufactured dwelling parks. And we need to, look at calling out manufactured home parks in your performance standard overlay, and then also some review and procedural criteria in terms of what's required for an outline plan and a final plan when applying for permits. So this also improves predictability, makes applicants and residents more clear when you're doing that process, and it reduces delays in permitting, which is really important. And then this is kind of a housekeeping one in the last recommendation, but there's always definitions. And if you talk with the city attorney, they say, hey, clean up your definitions. So part of any code is making sure when you say something in the code that the definitions are clear and can be interpreted correctly. So looking at updating those definitions to match what the state says, or particularly for manufactured dwelling units, manufactured parks, and prefabricated dwellings. Also updating what a recreational vehicle definition is, because those have changed, and we're looking at Sutherland. They have a good definition, so we're kind of looking at using that. Of course, we're going to modify that specific for Ashland and make sure it meets the community's needs. And then removing outdated items, and then applying definitions consistently across all chapters. Quickly, I'd like to get through this so we can have a discussion, but the next steps, we have our next committee meeting in February. That's where we're going to present this similar information and talk about the code, actual changes in the redlining of the code and moving forward into adoption. We're going to incorporate the feedback from this meeting and that next meeting into those code changes. We'll have a red line markup for your code update ready in March, and move into, again, that adoption process. So thank you again for listening to the presentation. I look forward to conversation and questions as we move through the rest of this meeting.
Anyone have any questions? Derek, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. I have lots. Do you want me to wait till the end, or can I go through a page of notes?
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this awesome presentation. I haven't been this excited in a while. As we go through the process, I was really excited to see the different groups and the community members brought in early. This is a really big potential zone change, and there's a lot of things I think that we're not going to get right, and the sooner we identify those, kind of the better. But some things that came up today while I was doing some research were mainly around increasing the dimensional flexibility that you talked about. And that applies to both the form interior setbacks to the structures themselves, as well as the width, height, square footage of the structure. So I think the less restrictive we can be there as we move forward, I think the better. RVs, I think, are a major inclusion point that we need to not miss. So the definitions, as we look forward to different housing types in the future, we're really familiar with a manufactured home and how it goes into a park and how we used to go visit grandma. But as we look forward in the future, I think we should kind of look at blending more of an RV, a manufactured home, a modular home, a panelized home, a prefabricated home. There's a lot of different definitions that I think hit kind of the same housing type, especially as we kind of relate to House Bill 4064. And I'm not an expert. I know it just got implemented, but It's basically talking about cities treating these modular and prefabricated types kind of like we do a manufactured. So to call the zone, I think getting a full zone change is going to be tough, but if we can get it, to call it a manufactured home park zone might be a little bit off base because there's a lot of different types of homes that we're going to be able to bring in. Duplex, triplex, quadplex, and clusters is a big thing. We did just update the HUD standards for the first time. I think the first major overhaul in 50 years, there was like 60 points that they improved at the federal level. So now manufactured, HUD stamped, federally approved, plop them anywhere. The city doesn't get to come in and look at them. They can be 2-story. So the densities that we were looking at, I thought were a little bit shy when we were looking at 23 units per acre. I mean, we can almost hit that today in our base zones with duplexes. So it's not just a 12-foot by 30-foot long or double or single or triple wide. Like, we need to be thinking about stacked units. Anthem is already making really cool side-by-side duplex manufactured units. We can go 2.5 stories or 35 feet, I think, in some of the overlying base zones that we might put this over. I've got a few more. Sorry, I'll go quick.
No, go ahead.
That density, the duplexes, the support of the ROC or the residential owned communities, I think, is really important. And if you haven't already, we have like some of the best resources here locally with our state representative, and then we have one of the last residentially owned communities in our region that was purchased in Talent, and there was also a manufactured home zone that was amended and codified after the fires to do a moratorium. So like, we've got some pretty good data just right next door that we could also look at and bring into the discussion. And then the affordability requirement is another one I think we need to be really careful with. The term that we're using is the naturally occurring affordable housing. A lot of the naturally occurring, I think, is because some of these infrastructures are old and outdated. And if we go into a park and we have to, again, we saw this in Talent when a whole park burned down, maybe there was 80 units. When they went to rebuild, they could only get 50-ish units, and they couldn't share a 4-inch sewer lateral for 40 units. They had to bring in 12-inch mains and put in manholes, and before they know it, it was $1 million of infrastructure. And as we know, that's going to greatly increase the prices. And then the last thing on affordability is also with some of our awesome state laws that we were able to get passed this year. There's some thresholds for these rent requirements and these rent reductions at like 30 units or say. So I think as we reduce the barriers and as we add kind of more flexibility, we also have to be careful that we're not designing the perfect recipe for syndicators, large investors, Wall Street bankers to come in and buy these. This is an amazing asset for out-of-state investors because you own the land, there's very little upkeep, the resident owns the house, you have them by the short hairs. It's not really naturally occurring affordability. It's like, it's the only thing people can afford, and they have to maintain their own thing, and then all the infrastructure under them is outdated. So if we rezone these and we're trying to tell these park owners they need to upgrade, it's just going to be huge price increases, and that naturally occurring affordability, when they come up to standard, will no longer be. So those are some things I think that I'm thankful to be able to bring to the table. I'm willing to work and help, but those are some things that I thought needed to be maybe looked at a little bit further as we progress through this. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Chair. I agree with some of what Derek says. I disagree with the wholesale use of recreational vehicles to be able to be allowed in these types of zones. And I think we should start with our definitions first. It was your last page in the presentation, but I think that applies to if we fully define what these are, manufactured homes, recreation vehicles, we can then understand what code they've been approved by the manufacturer. For example, recreation vehicles don't have the same standard as a manufactured home or a tiny home or single dwelling. So I really feel like we should start with definitions first, and then we should invite the fire department, which they're not on this panel right now, but they should totally have a lot of say in setbacks, accessibility, whether these parks have master electrical service disconnects, and if the sewers are big enough or the water lines are big enough. I think that we should include those. And also, too, we should include in these modifications yard barns, overhangs, carports, things that are going to allow fire and other things to travel pretty quickly from one home to the other. I don't think we should make these as dense as possible and lower the standard of quality of living for the people in these parks. And as some people are elderly, some are children, and they need places to play. If we really overlook some of these parks that are in our city, the one on Siskiyou, to be more direct, there's hardly a blade of grass when you look at it from the satellite view. And I think if we're really interested in making these quality places for children and families and elderly, then they need to be held to the standard that, let's say, a single-family home, you not in the construction style, but in the coverage, lot coverage, and I think we did address that a little bit, but I would lean more towards not make them as dense as possible and improving the quality of life for the people who live there.
Susan? Susan? Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, had it backwards. Been a couple of weeks. I agree with Commissioner Herron on definition and the importance of that. And I do believe that, I mean, a simple thing that's used in insurance, as an example, is whether the plumbing is permanent or not. That makes a difference in the category by which a home is insured. Whether that matters or not, that's just, a point of fact that might be considered. But I see an opportunity to look forward as well. So, tiny homes have been mentioned. What I think of as flat pack homes, buy it for $50K on Amazon and slap it up. 3D printed homes, for us, it's an opportunity to think creatively, I think, and prepare for a future where, stick-built custom homes are, out of reach for more and more people over time. I do think that allowing for community space is desirable and important for the livability. The example that was used, I wonder if those actually serve the residents or if those are income generating opportunities for the property. And I think that's important to consider in thinking about allowing those kinds of uses in the parks. And I wonder if I didn't see this addressed, and maybe it's a crazy idea, but in the category of possible incentives and bringing more of these communities into Ashland, whether there was any consideration of incentives that would be related to annexation of land in the urban growth boundary. I'm just curious because that could be an opportunity to create more volume as opposed to rebuilding or infill. Those are the highlights. Thank you. Okay, great. Mayor?
Thank you. A couple of things. I had a question about the exterior material mandates. Could you speak a little bit more to that, Scott?
Yeah, and Brandon, please weigh in. But I think right now it has there's requirements for specific types of materials that would not be allowed for some of the ideas that were brought up. Specifically, the whole idea about a modular home or a 3D printed home. I don't know. There's things that I don't know exactly off the top of my head what those materials are, but there's a limited list, is my understanding, for what the siding would need to be, for example, or the roofing type. And the thought was to not need to prescribe those and to be more flexible with those types. Even you'll see that with different types of metal siding or more modern types of cement, where they do stamped cement and things like that. So the whole idea again is more flexibility of the types and not being prescriptive about a specific list of materials that would be required for manufactured homes, or that broader home type that we've talked about tonight, which could include those other types as well.
Yeah, one specific material reference in our existing code is it states that manufactured homes, the material shall be similar in color, roofing, exterior siding, roofing, and which in color, material, and appearance are similar or superior to the existing exterior siding or roofing material used on nearby residences. And then it goes on to qualify that by saying superior, that wood or wood appearing siding is superior to metal. And I know from wildfire standards, metal siding is superior to wood. So looking at removing such limitations to promote more, fuel resistant, ignition resistant materials could be a good thing.
So, Brandon, I know that we also have regulations around fire-resistant materials that apply to all new building, new construction, and major remodels. And so with the requirement that we not treat these differently, it would seem that we would still say that regardless of the setbacks and things, they still need to meet those requirements. So we're not saying that there's an exception to this, because I think it's pretty terrifying to see what happens to wildfire when it gets into some of these parks.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the intent would be to and allow someone to use ignition resistant materials without obligation to provide wood siding or something along those lines.
But they would have to stay within the regulations that we have now.
Yeah, for new construction,
construction.
but that new construction, the building code is in reference to, and I'll get too technical, but R327.4 under the state allowances stipulates that our community, because we have a wildfire overlay, can regulate new construction. So a manufactured home that's built elsewhere and brought to site isn't regulated in the same way by the Building Codes Division. So we don't have the ability to hold that unit to our local building code for stick-built homes. But I think that we can ensure that we're not limited. Trying to think. So if there was a wood-built home that passed BCD inspections, being built in a factory and was brought into Ashland and located on site as a manufactured home, our building inspectors don't process a plan review to ensure that its materials are in compliance with 327.4. So, I'm not sure that we have a handle by which to temper what the HUD requirements are for what's certified as a manufactured dwelling.
In the interest of time, I will have some more comments later.
Thank you.
Noah?
Yes, good evening. I think in the same vein as Councilor Sherrill, I've got a nice big page. I'm going to cut them down quite a bit, though. So the first is, you said on there you had 2 interviews with park owners. And you also said, I think you said something like only 1 considered transitioning models. If you only interviewed 2, did you mean only 1 of the 6 or 1 of the 2?
Good question. 1 of the 2.
Oh, okay. Oh, so is it possible that more would be interested or consider transitioning models
None of the ones that we reached out to, the three that we reached out to were the three that were in the city limits. So Wingspread, Tolman, and Pines basically were the three that we did those interviews with. So we didn't we didn't actually interview the three outside.
Gotcha. Okay, no, that's fine. And then next question is on inspection requirements for a lot of housing stability support service programs require either HQS, housing quality standards, or Inspire, and I'm not even going to try and remember what Inspire stands for, inspections, and they relate a lot to not just livability and appearance, but also to safety. And so I know that a lot of the considerations are about what the materials are being made of, and so I do want to echo the concern about the change to that. I know in the community wildfire protection plan that was reviewed and I believe adopted, over half of the respondents to the community engagement survey indicated that they were low income, and nearly a quarter lived in mobile home parks. And this report cites, pulling it back up, severe wildfire risk due to poor insulation, lack of defensible space, and high housing density. Of the 2,500 homes destroyed in the 2020 Alameda fire, 1,500 were manufactured in mobile homes. So I totally understand the need or desire to reduce the size requirement, size minimum. The density increase, I think we need to be really cautious and careful about, considering the sheer breadth of damage that occurred disproportionately to mobile home parks and manufactured home parks. And then what counts as a percentage of the area for commercial buildings of the park? That was one of the things that was listed as a consideration. Are we talking patios or floor space or auxiliary buildings, or was there any? I didn't see it, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Are you talking about the other uses beyond the housing type? Yeah, so right now we're looking at limiting the total square footage of the building rather than kind of the percentage of the area. But that's a really good thing to think about, because some larger parks might might want a larger building, or so I think looking at a percentage of the area as well as maybe the square footage of a building could be something we could explore. That's a good comment.
Okay, and then my last question, I think this is for Brandon. Development fees for new builds of mobile or manufactured homes, are they the same as single-family standalone structures?
So if you have an existing park and a mobile home is moved out of that park and a new manufactured dwelling is brought in, its permit fees are really only for the connection of that to water and sewer. And so it's a building permit. It doesn't have to pay systems development charges, which are the large part of fees, because there was already a unit there. And in a sense, the park has already paid that. If you were developing a new park with, let's say, 20 new units, each of those units would be assessed based on the square footage of those units, their impact fees on water, sewer, parks, transportation, and stormwater.
Okay, and then if part of one of the outcomes of this would be to increase the density, if one mobile home moved out or there was reduced in one unit, and then they brought in two new units to take the place, would the SDC fees be paid for that, or would essentially be net one unit?
The SDCs that relate to commensurate square footage would be, in a sense, grandfathered in. So if 1,000 square foot unit moved out and two 400 square foot units moved in, you would have credit for the 1,000 square feet towards the water, sewer, However, the transportation STC is based on unit size, and so you would be in a position of, well, in that scenario, transportation is only 50% of the normal fee for units less than 500. So in that scenario that I just made, it would all be a wash and there wouldn't be additional STCs. But if the density of a park were increased and you just had more room and you could put in another full unit, it would be assessed STCs at the full rate.
And I would add, Noah, that if it was in a deed restricted affordable housing park, like, I think there's some, the Talent Park, and if you could ensure that these units would be deed restricted to be affordable to homeowners at 80% of the area median income or below, then we could waive those SDCs, potentially.
Okay, thank you. And then one more, I'm so sorry if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
For all recommended changes, compliance with ongoing changes, how are they going to be monitored? I think that the language says something like you must come into compliance. What triggers that? What triggers that if a mobile home park decides to make updates, make the recommended updates?
So perhaps Scott can react to this question as well, but I think the intention, and again, the code hasn't been drafted, but the intention that we've discussed internally is if that a manufactured home park was looking at adding a unit in order to take advantage of the increased density or put 2 units where one was previously, that would be the nonconformities of that park. And I'll give a hypothetical example. Let's say its road is only 14 feet wide instead of 15 feet wide, that nonconformity could persist and wouldn't be triggered to bring the entire road into conformance to add that one additional unit. And that gets back to the cost feasibility of making those upgrades. So again, I think it would be that conditional use permit process by which it would be reviewed by the Planning Commission to determine that the exceptions to coming into standards are reasonable. You might make a counterexample where if a park had a substandard road and they were putting in 50 more units on an additional land area, that might be an opportunity to upgrade that facility. So again, I do think it's that's where the conditional use permit process would be used to evaluate. Scott, did you have any?
I think you nailed it on the head. I think that the idea there is that the Planning Commission can consider other things beyond just the code if you make it a conditional use. Those financial aspects, the safety aspects that we mentioned before. So that's the idea of introducing that process to allow for existing non-conforming uses to upgrade and continue.
And I would want to just point out, Noah, that I think it's great that you brought up compliance with housing quality standards and with the Inspire standards, and I think we should look at those, and we should decide whether they would be included in the definitions for what we would seek in any housing type that we're looking at, especially new housing types like RVs or tiny homes, because I think there's probably some fire egress pieces in there that would need to be met that might not be met in certain circumstances, and so that should be outlined ahead of time, and that would be a decision point for all of you in this process. Great.
Okay, on this side of the room. Comments?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, thanks, Scott and Brandon and Linda. I'm really excited about this coming before us. It's been kind of a long time since we talked about how important it is, and so and I can see a lot of really good work has been done on it. When I think back though to 2022 and 2023, when I was really excited about this, what drove the principal concern that drove my excitement is to ensure stability of folks who reside in a park who are really vulnerable if, in the case of that, a decision of an owner, park owner, to develop it as something else. Now, it's, I guess, in some ways encouraging that we don't see, or the report from the current owners has not suggested that they are planning to do that, but that's not particularly comforting because it's those things can change and as circumstances change. So I'm very, very interested in those provisions that you mentioned about ensuring some sort of appropriate right of first refusal and time frame for putting together the financing for all that. I think from my perspective, parks are a type of naturally occurring affordable housing, as Brandon was terming it. I think, but there's a peculiarity to it that makes it very risky for the people who own homes there on rented land. There are some, there's a lot of vulnerability that they could be displaced from their home by the independent, profit-minded decision of the park owner, which I think limits, to some extent, the interest in investing in those homes. The homeowner is actually investing in it now, despite those risks and despite the concerns. There's some lovely homes in each of these parks that I know. So that's a wonderful thing. I think there would be more of that, though, if it weren't so risky. If we could kind of deal with the disjunction between the interests of the park owner and the interest of the owners of the unit. So I'm looking for ways, and so I think I'm looking for ways that will really give the residents who own the structures an ability to really and a security to take advantage of some of these great things that you're talking about in the code. But I'm not quite seeing it there. I'm not sure that I see that just giving them those opportunities to do those kinds of redevelopment, more units on land, bigger, more dense, all these kinds of things. I think I'd like to giving folks the flexibility, but I'm not sure that I see that there's enough there to give the residents the comfort, the real security that they can invest in that, not risk losing their money. So I'd like to see what we could do that gives them more of that, or tries to address that kind of disjunction of crossed incentives. I don't know how you do that, but I don't see. I don't see that we were necessarily there yet. So one of the things that I was trying to sort through as I went through all of the different recommendations is which of these recommendations are really a benefit to the resident, which are of primary benefit to the park owner, and then of course there are some that are a benefit to both, and really trying to be clear about that so that we can really kind of judge what kind of changes might really benefit or generate that sort of ability to invest in the upgrading of individuals' homes. Does that make sense? Is that something that you think you could kind of tease out?
I really like that comment, actually. I mean, I'm not sure that we can tease it out entirely accurately, but I think you can probably put some of these recommendations in buckets in terms of, a lot of them, as you mentioned, are going to benefit both, and a lot of them are going to benefit some of the policies and things you have in your housing production strategy, for example, because they're forwarding those goals and those policies. So I think there's a third piece. It's not just it's the residents, it's the owners, and then it's just Ashland as a whole in terms of being a place for all to live and have affordable places to live. So I think maybe we look at kind of three buckets, and I'd be happy to kind of do that as part of the future presentation and kind of trying to identify loosely. I mean, I don't want to tie these directly because it's hard to do that, but I think that perspective is a good challenge in terms of all of us making these changes and then adopting this and making that decision. So I appreciate that. I think it's a good perspective.
Are there additional things that you can think of that you've seen elsewhere that provide additional security to the residents so that they can, legitimately contemplate investing resources in doing some of these upgrades? So upgrading a unit is costly, especially if you want to put a second story on it or replace it with a two-story structure. It's kind of mind-boggling to think of somebody doing that when they really don't have the protections, on the ground. So I wonder what sort of protections what sort of things that would take. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it anything more than what we've presented. I mean, I'm not saying that what we've done and the research we've done is an end all be all, but you know, it's fairly unique. It's not done very much. And that, again, I mentioned that when we did these case studies, I had expected more jurisdictions to have tried to tackle this, and they really haven't. So, you know, I would be very open to other ideas or other best practices that maybe we haven't found, and incorporating those here in terms of those protections. But, you know, that was the goal of this project initially, and I think that should be something we should continue
Yeah.
to ponder.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at this, I think it's I think it's maybe virtually impossible to really generate that kind of security, short of the residents themselves owning the community, making it a resident-owned community or a co-op. That's what a co-op is. We have lots of residential co-ops in different parts of the country, build single buildings. Talk about density. You got co-ops in New York City, that have been owned cooperatively for many, many years. And they're difficult, just like any co-op, to manage. But that's where you get at that disjunction of incentives of who owns the land and who owns the specific units. Now, we're not talking about, you can't, I don't think that we can force that, and maybe the communities aren't necessarily even prepared to take on that ownership responsibility because it's a big deal. But I'd like to see what we can do that mimics that as closely as possible.
As a point of order, let me interject. I think that the co-op model is one we should be looking at decisively. We saw it in a mobile home park, manufactured home park that we went to in Talent last year during our retreat, and the residents there had gotten together and bought the property under the mobile home parks, and it was presented to us as a very, very good model that people could understand and work with. And so I think if we can set up something that would expand on the notice that's given if a mobile home park owner wants to redevelop or wants to sell, we can expand on the notice that's given to the tenants and the idea that they would have 3, 4, or 5 months to organize themselves and understand what this would be, what ownership would mean, and research some grants and find some financing. That might be a path that we can offer in our zoning code updates that would actually be used. And we can also, another thing I was thinking of is that we can also encourage people in mobile home parks who are residents to organize themselves now
Right.
and be ready for that, even though they might not need it for 5, 10 years. But just to understand what's needed, what's recommended, and work with, I think there are organizations out there that can help tenants do that. So if we can encourage them to start now, I think that would be beneficial for them and probably give them a sense of security that they can move forward with.
I really.
There are probably hundreds of these across the country at this point. I mean, it's not a new model for manufactured home parks. You're absolutely right that it takes time, and the rate limiting factor really is that coming to the table to try to put together an association or co-op or a collective ownership structure to buy from a standstill from zero is really difficult. So 60 days plus 120 days to put together the financing. That's really, I think, very, very difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but getting that, organizing it way ahead of time, as you suggest, years ahead of time. That's not really a zoning question. That's really more, assistance. There's all kinds of organizations that provide that sort of support if the communities themselves are interested in going down that path. They often aren't, but sometimes they are.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that there's only, sometimes we think that our zoning code is kind of a silver bullet, and there's only so much we can do with that. And I think the conversation of utilizing other groups and partners and, using your Housing and Human Services Committee to champion some of these things and be supported and are really important things that you need to do as a city beyond just updating your code. There's, they kind of go together hand in hand, and that's super important.
Okay, moving on to other folks who want to say something. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Planning Commission, for having us and staff. Yeah, this is very exciting. I echo a lot of what Councilor Kaplan has just said. I've been excited about this since I was invited to Wing Spread by the residents to look at their situation and embark on this process. So I was glad that we're here now, and thank you, Scott, for the presentation. I'd like to ask a baseline question, not being a planning wonk. Can this be a top-down decision? You've interviewed landowners, but can we as a city have the authority to make this zoning distinction and then impose it upon the landowners?
I'll let Scott speak to that as well, but from my understanding that under Measure 37, should the city impose zoning restrictions on a property, that property owner can look at any reduction in value and look for the city to compensate for that.
Okay.
So the city does have its authority to impose zoning restrictions on a property, but it's not without risk. And that is, in one way, that some of the owner benefits, to use Councilor Kaplan's term, are incentives that could offset any reduction in value. And I also wanted to note, which I don't think was clarified earlier in the conversation, we're talking about kind of a two-phased approach. One is making modifications to the manufactured development design standards that would be applicable in any manufactured home park, and also the potential of creating a new manufactured home park zone, which I think is the meat of your question, that then as a separate ordinance would delineate existing parks or parks that are in the urban growth boundary when they annex into the city would be zoned manufactured home parks. And the only permitted use, and it's listed as a special permitted use because it has to meet the manufactured home park design standards, would be the allowable use in addition to any kind of community serving uses that are delineated in that code. So it would remove the potential of redeveloping the site for, apartment complexes.
Mm-hmm.
So that is another protection of parks that was intended when this was added to the housing production strategy. Again, I don't see it as necessarily, I don't see it as necessary in order to move forward with some of the other manufactured home park standards, but it is a component that would be coming back before these bodies for consideration.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question.
You did,
And-
I'm really glad to clarify. I think that the landowners are benefiting from a profitable business, and we want to, maintain that environment. But also, I believe that the residents are really asking for that security. And if I was a park owner, I would want the option as well to develop, for whatever intents and purposes might come down the road. But for this exercise, I feel like we should really be looking at changing those different zonings, getting them all cleaned up and on the same playing field, and then what do we do to encourage additional parks within the city of Ashland? And when we have assuming we have our own MHPZ or whatever acronym we're going to call it, is there anything in the city inventory for land banking and land trust? As my colleague has pointed out, we own a construction company. We can do roads, we can do infrastructure. Hasn't been called upon cities to do that really before in the past, but maybe it's something that we do with one of our test cases, and we develop our own piece and sell it to a co-op of people moving in. But along the lines of the recommendations, I think they're amazing, and I would also be curious if there's any kind of like mandatory upgrade, like I don't know if there's like a 10-year upgrade, because I think it's been pointed out we have some subpar infrastructure. We don't have electrical vehicle charging in these parks. We don't have a lot of things in these parks, I think, that would really benefit the residents. And as a landowner, I mean, when something breaks, you fix it, but maybe you're not looking to invest in your business here. You're just kind of looking to get by. Is there anything that we could do to, be proactive to either a carrot or a stick for this zoning to help keep up with infrastructure improvements? And then the other only thing I had on here, that's it. That covers it. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Werner. Thank you, Scott, for your presentation. I'll be brief. I just want to follow up on a point that Councilman Kaplan made earlier, and that is that in looking at the code recommendations that you've made, the challenge that I have from an economic standpoint is that I really see and understand the investor-owned park model as fundamentally a market failure, and that we're trying, while we've addressed this and we've talked, well, I shouldn't say we've addressed it, but we've talked about it this evening, it's difficult to do that with code changes. And I think that, Councilman Kaplan's remarks regarding resident-owned communities, perhaps there's a separate channel for which we could support that, because I do think that many of the problems that you're seeing in these communities are a result of this split asset ownership, where the residents own the depreciating asset and the park owners own the appreciating asset. And that creates an asymmetry in market power that results in a lot of the difficulties that you see with these communities. And so that's all I really want to say. Thanks.
Derek, did you want to comment again?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Herron brought up a good point. The definitions are ever important, but the devil's also in the details. And just a quick run through Sutherland's definitions. I mean, they're very comprehensive, and in development, comprehensive means expensive a lot of times. And because we're already using Portland as a case study, I would just strongly suggest that that the consultants and staff take a good look at the occupied recreational vehicle code that the city of Portland has. It's one page that defines an RV. And what we've seen is we have almost 5 years of data in the city of Portland where tiny houses are legal in residential zones. And the definition of a tiny house can be found on one page in the occupied recreational vehicles code. So I would just hope that we can look deeply into that definition, and then also a case study at the over 1,000 units that have been permitted legally in the city of Portland, and it'd be a good case study. And then the only other thing that I heard that came up was a really good point with R327 standards being applied to construction that's post HUD placement. And when you talked about, Scott, the reduction of size of carports or mandatory decks, when we look at using fire resistant materials and large dimensional lumber or metal to build those different requirements for site design review that we currently have, like if we can reduce those sizes, we can reduce the costs. So those were the only two things. Thank you, Chair.
If I could clarify just a moment on the R327.4, it would apply to the manufacturer. It would not apply to the manufactured home itself, but our building code, in order to do a new deck or a new carport, is subject to R327.4. And as such, it would have to be made ignition resistant compliant with those standards, which would add cost because the deck would no longer be open 2x4s with open underneath. It would have to have screening or be built with larger timbers or metal, as you indicated. So thanks for that clarification.
Susan? Oh, sorry, Jay.
Thank you, Chair. This is a preliminary discussion, so I'm just going to raise 2 points that haven't yet been mentioned. And the first relates to the tenants' rights issues that have come up. And I'm wondering if the consultants have had an opportunity to consider, in addition to the Ashland Municipal Code, Chapter 110, which deals with condominium tenant rights, is something you discussed in our packet. If you've also had an opportunity to look at Chapter 90 of the Oregon Revised Statutes, which provides for tenant rights in manufactured dwelling parks. And I only ask now so that we treat this as an opportunity to harmonize that part of state law with this new ordinance under consideration and try to blend that with some of the principles that's in the condominium tenant rights policy. So that's the first point. And the second point is that I really appreciate the consultant's identification of a proposed change to a part of the Section 180 portion of ordinance that allows for the use of a performance standard option for manufactured housing development, redevelopment, I guess is what we're considering within the R2 or R1-35 zones. I think it's important to clarify here in the new ordinance that the PSO procedure can apply to MHD applications, but that the substantive requirements of an outline plan and a final plan would not control such applications, but rather only this new ordinance would control the application decision rather than the PSO standards, if that makes sense. So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
Just one more observation. I'm not sure quite how to say this, so I may wander through it a little bit, listening to the discussion too. And I'll reference my mother. So my mother sold her house in Ashland at more than 10 times the value that they had purchased it in 1964. But then she really had no option but to move to Talent in order to live in a place that was that met her standard, her standards of quality as well as her affordability expectations. And as I listened to all this, I'm 100,000% in favor of affordability, but I wonder if we're thinking also in terms of, other demographics and, and our intent in terms of, what we want the outcome to be from this policy, again, beyond preserving the parks that we have in ways that are meaningful to our community, but also preserving Ashlanders' ability to stay in Ashland, for example, as they age, and they don't want to have to mow the lawn or, as their circumstances change. So, just kind of listening to the tone of the discussion, that came to mind to me. I would hope we would do well and do it very thoughtfully as we go forward, because we're Ashland, I guess.
Could I make a follow-up point? Chair Werner?
Sure.
Could I please make a follow-up on that? Thank you. I think your point is really well taken, and you've mentioned the importance of increasing the volume and availability of affordable housing in Ashland. I think that this new ordinance presents an opportunity for us to use the manufactured home development as a means of increasing housing supply in Ashland. The general provisions of the existing code limit manufactured home development to the R2 and to the R-3.5 zones. I'm wondering if there is a good reason for that constraint. And I'm not yet familiar enough with the buildable lands inventory that would comprise the R3 zone, for example, to know whether it's a good idea or not to extend the availability of a manufactured home development to the R3 zone, for example, or even to the Croman area. So that's just kind of by way of floating an idea, not expecting any, conclusion to it tonight, but just wanted to throw it out.
Noah, did you have additional comments?
Yes, one additional comment. Thank you, Chair. I think on your slide 30, it talks about allowing for financial hardship considerations during a review for clear redevelopment paths for existing parks. And we were kind of touching on it a minute ago, and I want to know what you meant specifically about that line, about that sentence, about whether it referred to the financial hardship of a existing park and the loss, like I think Brandon was talking about, the loss that they may incur in land value if we change coding, or if you were referring to the cost of any upgrades.
Great question. I'd love to clarify. We're specifically talking about the financial burden of the required upgrades.
Okay.
So that would be that example of widening a road that Brandon said to meet code. Maybe that's a financial burden, and if they can come in and ask for a conditional use permit that would say, this is a big financial burden for us to widen these roads and put in curbs and sidewalks. Can we continue to be non-conforming with this 12-foot road instead? So it's that financial constraint, a hardship, rather than the inverse that you mentioned.
And then a follow-up to Brandon, is that the mechanism by which someone would demonstrate financial hardship, is through a conditional use application?
Yeah, so again, it relates to an application to expand a park or to modify it in some way, that they might be asking for an exception in the form of a conditional use permit to not meet all the standards and bring the park 100% into conformance. One that comes to mind most readily is the issue of density. If you had an existing park that had more units per acre than would be allowed under the existing zone, that's an existing nonconformity. And we don't want to create a situation by which a park wanted to do an upgrade to their water main, and we're told that, well, in order to get approval for those building permits, you have to remove X number of units to come into conformance. So again, that would reduce their viability as a park. They would argue that the existing nonconformity should persist, and the financial hardship of removing units and the rent proceeds would prohibit them from making those upgrades. So again, we're speaking in terms of hypotheticals. I think the point to note is by having a provision within the code for consideration of such nonconformities at the front end, we're not in a position to not consider those arguments if an applicant came forward and wanted to do some modifications but not come 100% into conformance.
Okay, and just a technical question, to demonstrate that financial hardship, does a park owner need to open their books to the planning department?
If their argument was based on financial hardship, and currently our standards for exceptions can also include their proposal is equal or better. But if they were looking at having a exception based on financial constraints, they would have to enumerate those constraints in the application to make that claim. But again, most non-conforming situations that we see currently, and they're not in manufactured home parks, are really the building's built too close to the property line and we'd like to expand it. To pick up and move the building over to conform is a difficult undertaking. So can we just do an addition to the existing non-conforming building? And the answer is yes, through our non-conforming provisions.
Yeah, this comes back to the conversation about looking to encourage more manufactured home parks in Ashland. And one of the things that continually comes back to me is just what land costs look like and what does that mean in terms of just the financial restriction on what is possible. And a lot of our conversations have said we have to go up because of the cost of land. And so with three of the parks, the three that are inside the urban growth boundary right now, or within the municipal boundaries, you had the acreage on them in your presentation, and two of them, by my calculations, were coming out around 6 units of an acre. And that's those are not numbers that get us to affordable housing typically with the underlying land costs that we have. And so I'm very interested in protecting the existing parks we have. I'm very interested in, if parks come in to our municipal boundaries, that they come in as parks and they remain as parks. But I am not sure that this council or this community should put a lot of energy into trying to encourage more mobile home parks or manufactured home parks, given the reality of the financial, that financial reality of the land. I think we might be better served to do an ordinance, to do a zoning overlay that protects those existing parks, and then looks at what are some of the other ways that we can provide that housing. We can partner to build that housing in ways that go up and take advantage of the density that you can get to when you get into multiple floors. And I understand that, manufactured homes are now being built 2 stories and that kind of thing, but I think a lot of this is, we've done a lot of work to say you can go up to 4 stories, you can go up significantly higher. And so it seems to me that we should just be careful how much we think that even simply incentivizing something like this could turn into something, because I think most people with a flat piece of land in Ashland, no matter what we put in place, a new manufactured park is not going to be something that they're interested in. It seems to me that this is much more the case that these pencil in places that are more rural, where the land costs are not so high. And so just something that's been in my mind in terms of how deep do we want to go into the space of incentivizing new parks.
And actually, that gives me an opportunity to ask a question that I've been thinking about, which is, if we annex the parks that are outside the city limits now, we have a requirement for 25% of annexed area to be affordable housing. So if a mobile home park annexes in, how does that play out? And I hope you would give some thought to that, about how our existing requirement for affordable housing in annexations might play out if and when these 3 come in.
Yeah, I think that we do need to give considerable thought to that as part of this project and come back. Chair Werner raised that question with me previously, and I've had an opportunity to think about it. And in light of Mayor Graham's comments about the annexation of existing parks, I think that is existing housing stock that is not currently deed restricted, annexing into the city. This is an opportunity to look at our code and ensure that there isn't a disincentive for that annexation. They may need to annex for, quality water, sewer, and those kind of things. We want to ensure that that's, public health and safety issues are met. So we'll give that some consideration as we move forward and come back. There may be also an incentive base if somebody did have property outside the city limits wanting to annex new and create a new park. Is there some relief from some of those affordability requirements that could be considered? But those are policy issues that we can bring back as part of this discussion.
Okay. And the final question that I had is, you talked about interviewing 2 owners of parks. Did you interview residents of the parks?
No, we are scheduled to have an open house on this, in which we're looking at sending a notification to park residents to encourage their participation. Other than those that are participating currently on the Management Advisory Committee as park residents, we haven't done a public outreach on this as of yet.
Okay. I would hope you would make an effort to bring in the residents who live in these parks. Anybody else have any questions or? Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been definitely informative and interesting, and I look forward to seeing this back before us. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So with that concludes the issue for the evening, and we're into open discussion. Does anybody have any issues that they'd like to bring up? Hearing none, I would take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
So moved.
Motion and second to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. We are adjourned.